Hello, everyone. Today, we will explore the mysterious disappearance of a little girl who vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night. Her sister, who shared the bed with her, recounted a strange detail. A man wearing a wizard's hat had taken the girl away. This perplexing case remained unsolved for 35 years until the truth was finally revealed in 2024. Jessica Gutierrez was born on December 3, 1981, in South Carolina. As the youngest in her family, she had two older sisters and a brother. After Jessica's birth, her parents divorced, leaving her mother, Debbie, to raise four children alone. The family lived in a small town called Edmond, near the state capital. Despite many hardships, Debbie worked hard to provide for her family, and they maintained a close bond. When Debbie worked, the older siblings took care of Jessica, and during her free time, she always planned fun activities for her children. On June 5, 1986, the family had a typical summer day. 4-year-old Jessica played in the yard with her siblings while her mother did housework. That evening, they all had dinner together, and Debbie put the kids to bed. Normally, Jessica would sleep with her mother as the youngest child, but that night, her brother, who had an earache, slept with their mom instead, while Jessica shared a bed with her sisters. The oldest sister had her own bed, and Jessica slept with the middle sister. The next morning, Debbie woke up around 9 a.m. 6-year-old Rebecca, who had shared a bed with Jessica, came to her mother's room asking for cereal. When Debbie got out of bed and stepped into the living room, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The front door, which was always locked at night, was wide open, and their dog, usually outside, was running around inside. A curtain rod lay beneath the rear window, and its screen had been removed. Debbie rushed to the girls' room, but Jessica was not there. She also noticed scattered papers, which heightened her sense of alarm. When she asked her older daughters where Jessica was, Rebecca replied, "She's gone. A man with a wizard's hat took her." Initially, Debbie thought her 6-year-old was joking and searched the house, hoping Jessica had gone outside to play. But Jessica was nowhere to be found. Debbie scoured the house, thinking her daughter might be hiding, but soon realized Jessica was gone. Debbie returned to the girls' room and demanded that Rebecca explain what had happened. Rebecca repeated her story about the man with a wizard's hat. Debbie, becoming frantic, yelled at Rebecca, asking why she hadn't screamed for help when her sister was taken. Finally, Rebecca provided more details about what had occurred. According to her, Rebecca woke up in the middle of the night and saw a bearded man wearing a wizard's hat standing next to their bed. The man gently picked up Jessica, who was still asleep, and left the room. Rebecca, only 6 years old at the time, didn't fully understand what was happening. Terrified, she pulled the blanket over her head, thinking it was just a strange dream. After lying like that for a while, she eventually fell asleep again and didn't think to mention it to her mother the next morning. Realizing Rebecca's account might be true, Debbie immediately called the police. Officers inspected the house and concluded Jessica had likely been kidnapped. The perpetrator appeared to have entered through the living room window by removing its screen. Upon closer inspection, they found a fingerprint outside the window and sent it for analysis. Near the window, they also discovered a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts. Assuming it was an abduction, investigators installed a wiretap on Debbie's phone in case the kidnapper called to demand ransom. They also interviewed Rebecca, who once again recounted the story of the man in the wizard's hat. This time, she added that he had unplugged the fan and nightlight before approaching their bed. However, she couldn't clearly see the kidnapper's face, so her description provided little help to investigators. Police questioned Debbie at the station, asking her to recount every detail of the previous day. During the conversation, Debbie revealed she suspected an acquaintance might be the culprit. Just a few days earlier, she had ended a relationship with a man she had dated for several months. According to Debbie, he was aggressive, controlling, and often drank heavily. He wasn't happy about their breakup, and she thought he might have kidnapped her daughter out of revenge. Debbie called him from the police station, but he denied any involvement in Jessica's disappearance. The police decided to investigate him further but found no evidence linking him to the crime. They also looked into Jessica's father, but he had been living in another state for years and couldn't have been the perpetrator. Meanwhile, experts submitted the fingerprint found on the window to the FBI database, but there were no matches. Police shifted their focus to searching for Jessica, beginning with a thorough sweep of the area around her home. The house was in a suburban area surrounded by vast fields that stretched for miles. Police searched abandoned buildings, wooded areas, streams, and rivers, any place where Jessica might be found. The following day, the FBI joined the investigation, but there were still no leads on the missing girl. Police began distributing flyers not only in nearby towns but across the state. The sheriff also deployed a plane to survey the area from above. The search lasted several days, while Debbie, overwhelmed with grief, couldn't bring herself to join the search. With 3 other children to care for, she was torn between her responsibilities and her desperation to find Jessica. The police rarely updated her, only responding when she reached out. On Saturday, 2 days after Jessica disappeared, Debbie decided to call the sheriff to ask about their next steps in the search effort. In a tense conversation, she accused him of negligence and not caring enough about finding Jessica. The sheriff, in turn, claimed he had been searching tirelessly and warned Debbie that if she continued her accusations, he would pull his team off the case. Since Debbie's phone was still being monitored, the call was recorded. Debbie remained convinced that the police weren't doing enough to find her daughter, and with each passing day, her hope of finding Jessica alive dwindled. This despair persisted for months until an unexpected breakthrough occurred in the case. 10 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, police were faced with a series of new crimes. A local man broke into someone's home, but the homeowner drove him away with a weapon. Later, the same man stole a truck and drove it to North Carolina, where he broke into the home of a sleeping woman and assaulted her. Shortly after the incident, he was arrested, and his fingerprints were entered into the database. The results shocked investigators. The man's fingerprints were an exact match to those found on the window of Jessica's home. This man was Thomas McDowell, 27 years old. When Debbie heard the news, she immediately informed the police that she knew him. Debbie had met Thomas through some relatives, and just a few months before Jessica's disappearance, she had hired him to do some work at her home. During his 2 days there, he built a storage shed and repaired the porch roof. Another striking detail was that Thomas had a beard and often wore a tall cowboy hat. This led investigators to believe that Rebecca, who only caught a glimpse of the kidnapper in the dark, might have mistaken the tall cowboy hat for a wizard's hat like those she had seen in cartoons. However, the investigators faced a major hurdle. Despite the matching fingerprints, they felt the evidence wasn't enough to charge Thomas. Jessica's body had not been found, so they couldn't confirm with certainty that she had died. Additionally, Thomas's fingerprints on the window could potentially be explained as unrelated to the kidnapping. Since he had worked at Debbie's house for 2 days, it was possible, albeit unlikely, that he had left the prints during that time. Forensic experts examined the fingerprints and noted they appeared fresh, unaffected by weather conditions that might have altered their appearance. Debbie also mentioned that she frequently cleaned that particular window. Her children would often play in the yard and press their hands against the glass to call for her, leaving smudges that required constant cleaning. Thomas had worked at Debbie's house about 6 months before the kidnapping, and at the time of the investigation, no other fingerprints were found on the window. This suggested it was highly improbable that Thomas's prints had been left months earlier. They would have been wiped away during Debbie's regular cleaning. Debbie added another significant detail. During Thomas's time working at her house, she had once accidentally locked herself out and left her keys inside. She had to climb through the very same window, and Thomas had witnessed this. Despite these compelling details, the police were not convinced. They continued to argue that there wasn't enough evidence to charge Thomas. In 1987, Thomas was convicted for assaulting the woman whose home he had broken into and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Debbie was devastated when she learned that the police refused to charge him in her daughter's kidnapping case. But there was nothing she could do. That same year, a new development emerged. A fellow inmate of Thomas contacted the police. claiming that Thomas had confessed to the crime. According to the account, Thomas had kidnapped a little girl from her bedroom in South Carolina. During the act, the victim bit Thomas, and in a fit of rage, he killed her. Thomas then dismembered her body, took it to a field, and abandoned it there. Investigators in Jessica's case went to the prison to speak with Thomas. He did not even bother to deny his guilt. However, he declared that he would confess if he was granted complete immunity from prosecution. Naturally, the authorities could not accept such terms, leaving the police once again without a resolution. A fellow inmate, frustrated by Thomas escaping justice, wrote a letter to Debbie detailing the story. Debbie was shocked to learn that Thomas still had not been held accountable, but there was little she could do. Frustrated by the police's apparent inaction, she decided to conduct her own investigation. At one point, she discovered an abandoned vehicle that once belonged to Thomas and examined it herself. On one of the seats, she found fibers matching the color of the pajamas Jessica had been wearing on the night she disappeared. However, the police were skeptical of this lead, questioning how an untrained civilian like Debbie could find such evidence in a vehicle. In 1987, another incident occurred. Police in Kansas contacted local investigators, reporting that they had found a girl who resembled Jessica's description. Jessica's mother immediately flew out, but her hopes were quickly dashed. As soon as she heard the girl's voice from the hallway, she knew it wasn't her daughter. In the years that followed, Debbie gave multiple interviews accusing the police of ignoring an obvious suspect. Unfortunately, this did not lead to significant progress. By 1990, Jessica's case was featured on a popular true crime television program. The exposure generated a slew of new leads, but sadly, all of them were dead ends. The following year, Jessica became the first missing child in South Carolina to have an age progression sketch created. In the early 1990s, this technology was still experimental, but detectives hoped it might help identify Jessica after so many years. Despite all these efforts, the case remained unsolved for decades. By 2007, 21 years after Jessica's disappearance, her mother once again accused the local police department of inaction. This time, she shared recordings of conversations with the sheriff, in which he suggested dropping the investigation and forgetting the case entirely. When confronted, the sheriff denied abandoning the case and claimed that after his conversation with Debbie, he had actually added more officers to the investigation. Debbie also complained that she had tried for years to involve other agencies in the case, but each time, the local prosecutor's office blocked her efforts. In 2007, the office reviewed the case again and confirmed that there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone at that time. In 2014, the sheriff faced charges related to fraud and bribery, leading to his removal from office and a 12-month prison sentence. 2 years later, the prosecutor was arrested for causing an accident while driving under the influence. He was fined $11,000 and forced to resign. By 2021, 35 years after Jessica's disappearance, a new sheriff named Jay reopened the investigation with FBI support. A team of 50 agents reviewed all the evidence and searched for new leads. They concluded that there was sufficient evidence against Thomas McDowell and uncovered additional circumstantial evidence. Friends and family of Thomas revealed that after Jessica's disappearance, he significantly changed his appearance, shaving his beard and long hair and abandoning his beloved cowboy hat. They also confirmed that he smoked the same brand of cigarettes found near Jessica's home. Unfortunately, DNA traces on the cigarette butts could not be recovered, likely due to repeated handling during earlier examinations. Although these factors increased suspicion of Thomas, the key evidence remained his fingerprints and the former inmate's testimony. Investigators ultimately believed they had enough to bring the case to trial. In January 2022, Thomas, now 62, was finally arrested after evading justice for decades. Despite his age, he continued to deny the charges, delaying the trial process for several years. The trial began in January 2024, with Thomas's legal team vigorously challenging the evidence. They argued that the fingerprints on the window could have been left when Thomas worked at the scene. They also attempted to discredit Rebecca, Jessica's sister, who had testified to seeing a man wearing a wizard hat. The defense claimed it was impossible to confuse a cowboy hat with a wizard hat, as the two were entirely different. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing the freshness of the fingerprints, asserting that weather conditions would have erased or altered them if they had been there for months. A former inmate testified about Thomas's confession in prison back in 1987, adding that only someone with inside knowledge could describe the crime in such detail. The prosecution also highlighted Thomas's earlier offer to confess in exchange for immunity, which had been rejected. The trial concluded on February 8th with the jury unanimously finding Thomas guilty. At age 63, he was sentenced to life in prison. For Debbie, who had always believed in his guilt, the verdict brought mixed emotions. She felt relieved that justice was finally served, but also regretful that Thomas had escaped accountability for 36 years. During that time, he had lived a full life while Debbie endured a lifetime of pain. Debbie continues to grapple with the pain of never finding her daughter's remains. Although nearly 4 decades have passed, she and the new sheriff remain committed to the search, even as the odds of success grow slimmer.